This is KZSU, Stanford. Welcome to Entitled Opinions. My name is Robert Harrison, and we're coming to you from the Stanford campus. Entitled Opinions began airing 10 years ago, believe it or not, and we're keeping it going here on KZSU for all you listeners who rely on it as a kind of intellectual lifeline. We don't know how many of you are out there, and we don't know if all of you are even alive. There are those who believe that radio is a spirit medium that can reach through to the other side, and that the dead are attuned to some of its frequencies. I'm down with that. Doesn't spook me in the least. I wouldn't air a show that I wouldn't air if I knew for a fact that the dead were listening in. That goes even for today's show, which is devoted to the Austrian-born eccentric Ludwig Wittgenstein, whom many consider the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. I don't share their opinion personally, but I'll confess, it's a little unnerving to imagine that Wittgenstein's ghost might be tuning into our program. He was a severe, judgmental, and at times nasty human being, and there's no reason to think he's changed much in his afterlife. But that's all right. We can handle Wittgenstein on Entitled Opinions. The song is Echo, the band is Glass Wave. KZSU's best.
It looks so good, it looks so cool, you punch your lips into the pool.
It's a real pleasure to welcome back to Entitled Opinions my friend and colleague Hans Sluga, whom you may remember from the show he and I did on Michel Foucault a few years back, April 18th, 2012 to be exact. Hans Sluga is a professor of philosophy at UC-Berkeley, author of several outstanding books, and will be posting his full bio on our website. But let me mention here only his two most recent publications. One is on Wittgenstein, called Wittgenstein, brought out by Wiley-Blackwell in 2011. The other goes by the title Politics and the Search for the Common Good. That one came out in 2014 with Cambridge University Press. These are two major books, and what we've decided to do is to devote one show to each of them. Today, Professor Sluga will share with us his eminently entitled opinion about Wittgenstein, the person, the philosopher, and the ethical thinker. We'll follow up with him very soon with another show about his fascinating new book, Politics and the Search for the Common Good. We have a lot of ground to cover with my guest, so let me welcome him to the show without further delay. Hans, it's great to have you back on Entitled Opinions. Thanks for coming down from the North Bay to join us here on KZSU.
Thank you, Robert, for this generous introduction. It's great to be back, and I remember our wonderful discussion of Foucault, and I hope we can do the same with Wittgenstein.
Yes, one of the very popular shows of Entitled Opinions. So let me begin by saying that Wittgenstein's personality was as complex as his philosophy, and your book deals admirably, really, in a way that I admire greatly, with Wittgenstein, the philosopher, tracing with great lucidity the meandering but steady course that his thinking followed from around 1911, 1912 until his death in 1951. And in this show, we'll have time to deal with only a few aspects of his thinking, and also, I hope, a few aspects of his personality if we get a chance. But let me begin with a broad question that you should feel free to take in whatever direction you want. So when we did our show on Foucault, I quoted from your faculty webpage where you wrote the following, I quote, "My overall philosophical outlook is radically historicist. I believe that we can understand ourselves only as beings with a particular evolution and history. For this reason, I have been drawn to the work of Nietzsche and Foucault. I am doubtful of the possibility of a pure a priori philosophizing. In consequence, I feel attracted to a realist and naturalistic view of things rather than any sort of formalistic rationalism. So, my question for you. Wittgenstein was anything but a historicist thinker, a la Nietzsche or Foucault, nor am I convinced that he had a realist or naturalistic view of things, yet you seem to be fascinated with him. Why?
Well, that's a great question to start with. In fact, you don't know how great the question is. I am just in the process of doing a second edition of the Cambridge Companion to Wittgenstein, which I and my student David Stern edited and published 15 years ago already. And
one of the most popular best-selling Cambridge companions of all, no?
Yes, it's been extremely successful, and so the publisher wants us to do a second edition. I took one of my own contribution out of the old edition, and I'm writing now a piece called Time and History in Wittgenstein. It's a theme that hardly anybody has thought about very systematically, and that seems to me, nevertheless, not surprisingly from my perspective, of course, of great importance. So, the point is that he starts off really not thinking about time at all. In the Tractatus, his first work, there's hardly a reference to time, and history doesn't get mentioned at all in his work. There is a wonderful sentence from the notebooks from which he extracted the Tractatus, 1916, in which he writes, "What has history to do with me? Mine is the first and only world." And it's paradoxical and strange, of course. He is a soldier in the war. He's fighting in a great historical battle. So what does this mean? But I think the Tractatus represents that kind of worldview. It's a kind of detached, timeless perspective on a world of static facts and their timeless logical relations, roughly. But he gets away from this, and that's what fascinates me. He gets beyond that point, though, and there are really two important steps, I think. One of them is that instead of thinking about language as a system of representation, he begins to think about it as a system of use and communication. And he is quite clear, use and communication takes place in time. So time becomes an essential category in his thinking about language. And that is projected also into other ranges, other areas like logic and mathematics. He says we must give up thinking about mathematics as this crystalline, timeless structure and think instead of actual processes of calculation and transformation and transition in mathematics. Yeah. So the first point is meaning is use. Second one is that he reads Oswald Spengler's famous and notorious book, The Decline of the West, in the late 1920s. And it opens his eyes to history. And it's a picture of history where the historical process is divides into different cultures and periods, ages. Each one has its own structure to it. Culture proceeds from primitive beginnings to hardening to civilization. And there are discrete and disjoint forms of culture. So this cultural pluralism in historicism becomes greatly important for him. It's something that he thinks through but comes to understand fully only very late in life, in the late 1940s, in notes called Uncertainty, this picture of our understanding of the world as historical, as consisting of different worldviews, which each has their own history and their own background. That's something that he slowly develops. So I want to say he's less an anti-historicist thinker than you suggest. And the picture of these worldviews is a naturalistic one rather than a rationalistic and formalist one.
Now we're talking about the later Wittgenstein.
Later Wittgenstein, right. Yeah, of course. Right.
So before we trace the difference between the earlier, the later, maybe the middle, even though in the early period, in the Tractatus, he doesn't mention history, time is not really a concern. Nevertheless, he did live through a very important historical moment and was a soldier during the First World War. He was also, as you've pointed out so persuasively in your book that he was paradigmatic of his own historical time. Can we first maybe can you tell us something about how you see him as being so much belonging to his particular historical moment in that specific geography that was Austria and Vienna in the early 20th century?
So when I look at the Wittgenstein literature today, then I'm struck by how variable and various it is. I mean, it's not only philosophers who write about Wittgenstein, but cultural critics, cultural historians, people concerned with literature and music, and in particular, of course, the history of the late Austro-Hungarian Empire and of fin de siècle Vienna. Wittgenstein was very much part of this cultural milieu, so he was born in 1889. And he grew up with people like Johannes Brahms and Gustav Mahler and Sigmund Freud, Adolf Loos, the architect, Karl Kraus, the critic of culture, and so on. So Vienna was a very small world, and everybody knew everybody, and the Wittgensteins were very much part of this environment. And so he reflects many of the attitudes, for instance, this attraction he has to Schopenhauer is something that's deeply Viennese at the time. This pessimism about culture is something very Viennese. And at the same time, this modernism that also appears in the work of Schoenberg and Mahler and Adolf Loos and Klimt, that too is very Viennese. And so he represents this combination of this pessimistic look backwards to a world that is falling apart, but also a concern with a new world, modern world, which is one of logic and rationality and technology.
And indeed, his pessimism was quite extreme. He believed that Europe was going into a dark age. He believed that well, I'm thinking now of a book of his was called Philosophical Remarks, where maybe it was as a result, as you mentioned, of reading Spengler and the decline of the West, but he has a preface there, and you draw attention to it in your book, where he says about Philosophical Remarks that this book was written for such men as are in sympathy with its spirit. This spirit is different from the one which informs the vast stream of European and American civilization in which all of us stand. That spirit expresses itself in an onwards movement in building ever larger and more complicated structures. The other, his spirit, in striving after clarity and perspicuity in matters in no matter what structure. And then he goes on to say that the first tries to grasp the world by way of its periphery in its variety, the second at its center in its essence. So here he does seem to have a sense that European American civilization it's been a long stream, and there's a kind of long history that adds layers and layers of complexity, and that in a certain sense maybe his essentialistic thinking is trying to be the counter movement to that, to get back to a certain kind of clarity and simplicity that was certainly characteristic of his early work and probably even his later work.
Yes, and so this sentiment actually gets repeated, of course, in the preface to the better-known Philosophical Investigations, where he says it's possible that his work will help to illuminate his time, but it's unlikely given the darkness of the time. So he gets back again to this idea of the dark times in which we are living. Yes, this pessimism is very powerful, but of course many philosophers ignore all this as a kind of sentiment surrounding the actual work, and they concentrate on the formal aspects of the work. So what he says about logic or language and meaning, and forget about these cultural backgrounds or cultural kind of motivations that really get him going.
Do you see strong parallels, if not convergences, between something like the Tractatus, the early work, and the architectural, I don't know what the technical term for it is, but it would say architectural minimalism of Alfred Loos, for example? And, Wittgenstein himself was involved in building a house there in Vienna with Engelmann, and who was a student of Alfred Loos. And there seems to be remarkable parallels between the two structures.
So yes, Loos is certainly a very important figure in his life. He's a forerunner of Bauhaus architecture and therefore of American modernist architecture, of course, as well. And he meets Loos. I forget exactly what the circumstances. He gets to know him personally, and they kind of talk to each other. They write to each other, and there is this moment when Loos says, "You and me are the same."
Are the same,
right?
yeah. And is that because both of them were trying to get back to the essential, get away from ornamentation,
yes.
and the almost not the atomic, that would be Wittgenstein's word, but the formalistic purity of in one case architecture, in the other case formal logic.
Yes, there's a certain kind of aesthetics they share, right? I mean, that the beautiful must manifest itself not in decoration attached to the fronts to the facades of houses, but it must express itself in the structural forms, in the relationships of the forms to each other. And I think the Tractatus wants to kind of elaborate that kind of, and wants to instantiate that kind of aesthetics as well. It's a work of literature as well as of philosophy.
Yeah. Well, let me say a little bit about my frustration with Wittgenstein over many, many years, where he just seems to me the archetype of the philosopher. He seems to fit into the notion of someone who inherited a great sum of money because his family was one of the richest families in Europe. He gives it all away, artists and and there are many periods in his life when he lived almost in a monkish way, gardening, school teacher. And it seems like he embodied a wisdom, a philosophical understanding that is beyond me. And for years I've been trying to follow this promise that if I stick with him long enough, he's going to deliver some rich insight or some feast of wisdom or knowledge. But I've come to the conclusion that if there is such a feast, it's just not for me, because I always come away from him hungry, whether it's the early Wittgenstein or the later one. And it's because there's something about the austere, let's say, straitjacket that he begins with in philosophically, that also has parallels with the house that he built in Vienna. And let me quote what he said about his own house. I mean, he didn't design the whole house. He only was responsible for certain aspects of it. But he says, "The house I built for Gretel is the product of a decisively sensitive ear and good manners and expression of great understanding. But primordial life, wild life starving to erupt into the open, that is lacking." And it's that lack that he sensed in his own house that I often sense when I read both the early Wittgenstein, above all, but sometimes also even the later philosophical investigation. Not so with culture and value, and when he's speaking about religion and other things, it's different. Do you have a certain frustration with what I would call this overly inhibited manner of doing philosophy for those of us who are used to, for example, reading Heidegger or Jean-Paul Sartre or the phenomenological tradition, where they let it rip a little more?
Yes, I mean, the austerity of Wittgenstein's prose, of his thinking, of his lifestyle are both astonishing and frightening, I think, at times. I'm always ambiguous about this. I feel I'm a much more Baroque personality. I'm open to lots of influences, lots of ideas, a much more kind of dynamic way of seeing the world and wanting to see the world in dynamic terms. But I think he represents a certain kind of thinking that is characteristic of a great deal of philosophizing. He is, as I said, a kind of paradigmatic thinker of modernism, high modernism. I compare him to artists like Malevich or Kandinsky, the formalistic Kandinsky, that is, or Mondrian. I mean, this idea of the reduction of aesthetic forms to simple straight lines and plain surfaces, that is something that appeals to him. He was brought up as a Catholic, though his family had a Jewish background, but there is something very Protestant, in a modernist Protestant way, to this way of thinking. And though I find this problematic, I nevertheless think it tells us something about who we are in our own century, in our own time. That's what's so revealing about it.
For sure.
Yeah.
So can I ask a few follow-up questions on, number one, Schopenhauer. I was very impressed and convinced by what you write in your book, that Schopenhauer was an influence on him all the way to the end, and that he never, even though he had some critical remarks about Schopenhauer later, that the philosophical pessimism of Schopenhauer stays with him, but also Schopenhauer in The World as Will and Representation, making this distinction between what can be said and then something which is beyond language or beyond expression, which would be associated with the aesthetic and the mystical. And there is this drive towards the unsayable and the mystical already in the Tractatus, whereof one may not speak, thereof one should remain silent, and that most of the things having to do with art and morality and so forth are beyond the limits of representation, whether it's formal, logical representation or other kinds of representation. And you see a strong Schopenhauerian inheritance here.
That's certainly true. It's a point that hasn't been noted that much, but I think it's a key in some ways to understanding Wittgenstein. Schopenhauer was very much widely read in late Viennese culture. He was sort of the philosopher that everybody had read. He also writes in extremely powerful and attractive prose. He's the teacher of Nietzsche in some ways, of course. And Wittgenstein, we have heard, read as his first philosopher Schopenhauer. In the 1930s, he gives us a list of the thinkers who have influenced him, and Schopenhauer comes first,
Yep.
right? And when you read the Tractatus, you can see that if you have the eyes to look for it, of course, if you have read Schopenhauer himself. And so the first sentence of the Tractatus is actually modeled on the first sentence of Schopenhauer's great work, The World as Well in Representation, and which Schopenhauer says the world is my representation, my idea. Wittgenstein says the world is everything that is the case. This ambitious, over-ambitious attempt to say something about the world as a whole and what it is something unique and puzzling and that they share. And they both end up taking back this initial proposition. Wittgenstein says that ultimately we have to come to see his propositions as senseless, we have to abandon them, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Mystical silence ensues. And this is exactly also where Schopenhauer ends up as well. He says ultimately it's the mystics and their silence that we have to follow, and we have to overcome these metaphysical inclinations. We have to overcome the metaphysical will, as he puts it.
Right. So do you believe that all that which in the Tractatus is beyond the limits of sensible, meaningful speech was really Wittgenstein's primary concern, even though his logical atomism, if you want to call it that, forbade him to speak of it?
Well, I see a kind of developmental process in the Tractatus, right? He reads Schopenhauer first before he really takes up philosophy seriously in a technical way. Then he gets to know Russell. He works with Russell. And the early parts of the Tractatus kind of reflect Russellian ideas very much and Russellian issues. But we see from the notebooks how in the middle of the war, when he's composing the Tractatus, he suddenly comes back to Schopenhauerian questions about the meaning of life, and he quotes Schopenhauer at that point. He clearly rereads him again at this point. So I think there is a return from Russell and Frege, the two great influences in this preceding period, towards back to Schopenhauer.
Right. And then he writes in 1929, he gives a lecture on ethics, which is one of the few, pieces of writing which is deliberately devoted to ethics. And there again, you think that Schopenhauer returns there in that essay, where Schopenhauer had written of the ambitions of philosophy that, quote, "To become practical, to guide conduct, to transform character are old claims which, with mature insight, philosophy ought to finally abandon. For here what is a question of the worth or worthlessness of existence, of salvation or damnation, not the dead concepts of philosophy decide the matter, but the innermost nature of man himself, the demon which guides him." And you claim that that is how Wittgenstein ultimately understood the ethical, as something that is inward and not normative. It's not the Ten Commandments. It's not Kant's categorical imperative. It's not telling you what is how to act and what is right and what is wrong. It's this sanctuary within a self that exists beyond the reach of the world of let's say the external world.
Yeah, so what I call both Schopenhauer's and Wittgenstein's ethics is a visionary ethics. It's an attempt to see oneself and the world in a certain way, and that this one gives one an understanding of the meaning of one's existence. That resolves the existential problem.
Right.
And so I think we should point out, of course, that Schopenhauer, as I said, is the great forebear of Nietzsche, and through Nietzsche has an influence on the existential tradition. He is, in a certain way, the first existential philosopher, with considerable significance also for Heidegger. And so I see a sort of existentialist element in Wittgenstein's thinking appearing there through Schopenhauer.
Well, it certainly seems very existential when, for example, when you quote, I guess from his notebooks where he's in the trenches in World War I, saying, I can die in 1 hour, I can die in 2 hours. I can die in a month or only in a few years. This seems very much like Heidegger's being unto death, but in a very concrete situation. And you write, living constantly under the gun, he is keenly aware that he may have no future ahead of him, and therefore he concludes, quote, man must not depend on accident, neither on the favorable nor the unfavorable. So then his question becomes, you say, how must I live in order to persist at every moment? To live in the good and the beautiful until life ends by itself. And this is what the ethical amounts to, in a sense, for Wittgenstein, because as he goes on to say, his own ethical experience is that of wonder at the existence of the world. It's also the experience of, I'm intrigued by feeling absolutely safe, whatever may happen. And finally, the experience of feeling guilty, not because of anything one has done, but absolutely and existentially guilty in the face of God. So this would seem to put ethics in a very different sphere than one normally associates it with. Not in the sphere of normative behavior and right and wrong, but this inward place of the self where one's being in the world takes on its own form.
Yes. So if one thinks of these three examples of the ethical that he gives in this lecture, one certainly wants to say these are religious attitudes that are expressed there. The wonder of the world is the thinking about creation, right? The creation of the world out of nothing, out ex nihilo. Being completely safe is the salvation he talks.
Is that how you understand it?
Yes, I think it is. He's talking about salvation, and feeling guilty, whatever one does, is original sin. So these are, I want to say, not only Christian but deeply Catholic sentiments he expresses in this fashion here, right? It is a certain way of seeing oneself in relation to the world as a whole, right? That's what ethics is really about, and thereby finding a meaning in one's life.
I was tempted to read that thing about feeling absolutely safe as if I can, in these trenches with all the bombs going around, if I can achieve clarity about life, about the limits of language, if I can get to this, if I can resolve the philosophical quandaries that have been afflicting me and the history of metaphysics, then I can feel completely safe because I've achieved what he calls that clarity and perspicuity that he speaks about in the preface. But I think now you've persuaded me that he's probably talking about the absolute safety of salvation, whatever would happen.
Yes, so in these wartime notebooks, it becomes clear that he's also quite strongly drawing on Tolstoy and Tolstoy's Christianity. And there the word safe is sometimes replaced by the word saved.
Saved, right.
I'm saved in the way the Christian soul is saved by this confidence in salvation.
And then there's that feeling of guilt, absolute guilt. It's almost like primordial guilt. Do you think that Wittgenstein suffered greatly from a sense of guilt? for which behavior was not the issue. It was just almost like existential ontological condition.
Yes, definitely, but he's not the only one who suffers from this. It's deeply built into the Christian ideology, and it's also even more strongly something felt by Viennese people in the late 19th century. It leads Sigmund Freud, to identify this feeling of anxiety, this neurotic sense, as a deeply, profoundly human phenomenon that needs treatment. So it's no accident that there is a connection between Freud and Wittgenstein. He calls himself at some point a student and disciple of Freud even.
Right.
So he rejects Freud's theories. He thinks Freud's conception of the self as sort of always in a state of anxiety and needing to be released from that is precisely what human life and what philosophy is about.
So if we can move on, Hans, to some of the fundamental, let's say, concepts of the philosophical investigations, which is the latter part of his career. In our philosophical reading group, which has been going on at Stanford for a long time, when Dick Rorty was still alive, we had a reading group on the philosophical investigations. And many of us, nourished on the continental tradition, existentialism stuff, we were trying to figure out what the big deal was in the philosophical investigations, that it didn't seem either to be so surprising what Wittgenstein was presuming to discover, nor particularly interesting. And Richard Rorty said, if you haven't suffered from the disease, then you don't need the cure. But many of us who were nourished in the analytic philosophical tradition, caught that disease, which is believing that language and the world and logic were as Wittgenstein had described it in the Tractatus, and that therefore Wittgenstein needed to be cured from his earlier misconceptions. But I suppose I find it hard seeing language, and when he says the world is all that is the case, my Heideggerianism says, well, wait a minute, look, what do you mean by world? What does being in a world mean? And is there a world without Dasein? Is there an Umwelt, surrounding world? Is there also, a larger cosmos? Anyway, do you agree that the philosophical investigations have their most value in terms of a therapy for those who are sympathetic with the kind of philosophy that the Tractatus is a great manifesto or testament of?
You can certainly say that the book is, first of all, a kind of self-diagnosis, right? He's looking back at his own earlier views and now taking them apart and trying to show what was wrong with them. But the views of language and meaning, and language as a system of representation with a very precisely defined deep structure, which we must bring and can bring out, is a picture of language that is still very much around. So he's not only diagnosing himself, not only diagnosing a philosophical view held by people like Frege and Russell earlier on, and his earlier self, but it's also one which is still deeply embedded in our culture. So I would say what he's attacking is, for instance, a picture of language as has been developed by Noam Chomsky more recently, right? And there are many linguists who hold that the Chomskyan picture of there being deep structures which we can identify, maybe universal deep structures in language, is still very much around.
Universal deep structures of language, I can buy. I buy it. That's a wrong metaphor, but it holds a lot of suasion with me. What I cannot take very seriously is the correspondence theory of truth that you have in the Tractatus, where you have propositions that have to have the same logical form as the facts that they represent, and the facts are things in the world, events in the world, concatenations. And, for me, I think in 1912, I was reading, there was a Cambridge Moral Sciences Club, and Wittgenstein gave a 4-minute paper in 1912 where he defined philosophy, and I'm quoting, all those primitive propositions which are assumed to be true without proof by the various sciences. And I say to myself, oh my, that's, for me, applies so well to the Tractatus. You get all these propositions that are stated apodictically, and they are told and not shown, and they don't seem to have any proof, or he doesn't feel under the obligation to prove any of them. So the question, you're absolutely right that many philosophers, academic philosophers of our own time, are still caught up in the view that you get in the picture theory of meaning and so forth. Why have they not been persuaded by reading the philosophical investigations that they are utterly wrong about that?
That's a very good question for which I really don't have a full answer. I think what shows itself above all is how strong our drive towards theory is, right? Both in philosophy and outside philosophy. We always think there must be somewhere, even if we haven't got it right now, there must be somewhere a complete comprehensive theory of everything. And that's what we're striving for. And what Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, tries to convince us of, that's a mistake, right? What we have instead is a world in which we live with certain human practices which we have acquired in a completely natural and historical fashion, and we maneuver and manage more or less adequately in there, and sometimes that expresses itself in some theory, a bit of theory, but the assumption that there is a theory for everything is a mistake, and a mistake that he felt he was himself engaged in his earlier work. So he says very interesting things about the Tractatus later on. He says, firstly, it's a piece of complete dogmatism. Mm-hmm. Everything is a dogmatic assertion in it. Right. Secondly, he said, every proposition in it is like the heading of a title of a chapter. In other words, it doesn't spell out any details. It just puts very large claims before us and leaves them there. And the third one is the most intriguing one. He said, every one of the propositions is the symptom of a disease.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Right, so he completely abandoned all this and tried to fashion a completely new form of thinking. And of course, he was convinced that he got to the later thinking only by having gone through the fire of this earlier philosophizing. Right.
Because the later thinking conceives of itself as a therapy.
Yes,
no?
Definitely.
Not changing the world, but as a cure, a healing process.
That's where Freud comes into. That's where he takes this metaphor of the therapeutic from, right? So in Freud, we have certain neurotic feelings, and the analyst helps us to describe them, to identify them, and thereby they dissolve. They maybe get displaced, and new neuroses appear somewhere else. They need then to be described and analyzed. And so the picture of the philosopher now becomes someone like this. He is concerned with philosophical confusions and trying to therapeutically dissolve these confusions, which, however, may manifest themselves in new ways in some other place.
So he was very much against theory,
yeah,
and he did do a lot to dismantle theories, to get back to the essence. So deconstruction would be the wrong word to use in his...
Why? I'm perfectly happy to call him a...
In fact, I
say the Tractatus is in some sense already the first deconstructive piece of philosophy.
I see. Yeah, because I would say then that what he says in the philosophical remark in the preface about having to get back to the center and go against the current of a European American civilization which has constructed more and more complex structures, and that philosophical theories, metaphysical theories need to also be dismantled and get back, where he says that philosophy has to return to the center of our true needs to get back to this essence, and that would involve a kind of deconstruction of and clarification of the way we use words. So in that respect, if you haven't, again, as Dick Rorty said, if you haven't suffered from the disease, maybe you don't need that particular form of therapy, although we do need philosophy, I believe, to get us back to the center of our true needs. And what those true needs are, he's not very, he's not very, let's say, expansive. But what I admire so much about your book is that your last chapter refuses just to give us an intelligent summary of the coherence of Wittgenstein's career as a philosopher and a thinker, but that you say, well, okay, there are certain things there in this corpus that will have a great deal of relevance to something that Wittgenstein never engaged in himself, which is the political. And you draw out the possible pertinence of some of the main concepts of the philosophical investigations, above all, for what would amount to a project of a creative retrieval of Wittgenstein and a reprojection of his thinking in a new sphere about which he did not have very much to say. And here these are concepts that have to do with his understanding of language, what he means by a form of life, what he means by a language game, and the application of rules. Can you speak a little bit more about what you were up to in that final chapter of your book?
Yes. So let me begin with a wonderful quote from one of his collaborators and friends, Friedrich Waismann, sorry. Waismann was a mathematician, and he wanted to kind of write down in a systematic way Wittgenstein's ideas about mathematics. And so they would get together every week and they would discuss the issue. Waismann would go home, write it down, bring it back to Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein would say, no, all wrong, we have to start all over again. Waismann at the end said it was impossible to write this book because he tears everything down that he had previously built up. I see Wittgenstein, the whole Wittgenstein, really very much in the light of this idea, namely that he is a constantly reconstructive but also deconstructive and destructive thinker. And so for me, learning from Wittgenstein doesn't mean to repeat and work out in more detail what he has already told us, but rather to ask yourself, what is the next step of destruction and construction? That's the first thought. The second one is what interests me in Wittgenstein is, and why I think he's such a great thinker, like Heidegger or Plato or Kant or Descartes, is that he really wants to identify the deepest and most pressing problems that exist for him and battle with those. And I want to say those problems that he worried about are no longer our deepest problems. So the foundations of mathematics was a deep problem at the beginning of the 20th century because there was a crisis in mathematics that has long past. We need to ask ourselves, what are our deepest problems? And these are really the problems of our social and political existence, I say. So we need to rethink Wittgenstein and what we can do, what we can learn from him by looking at these questions. And that's taking Wittgenstein and Wittgensteinian concepts in a direction which he, of course, he didn't at all anticipate, and which, however, we maybe can do something new with, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, this is Wiederholung. It's Heidegger's retrieval,
yes,
which is not repetition in the mechanical sense that you repeat a thinker's thought, but you give it new life by bringing out potential future legacies of it. And I agree with you that what you do in that last chapter is bring Wittgenstein's thinking around the center of our true needs in our particular historical moment, which is in the early 21st century, where the political, or namely, how can we live with one another? This is the crucial issue of how can we all live together? Human beings with human beings, but even human beings with nature, and that's how I understand the political. So could you get a little bit more specific when you discuss things like words or rules, and how you think one can make that transfer into the political sphere?
So there are, of course, other people who have thought in this direction before me. One of them is Peter Winch, who in the late 1950s, I think, already wrote a book called The Very Idea of a Social Science. And what he did was to use Wittgenstein's thinking about language and use and meaning as a critique of the idea of social science. Our understanding of the social world can't take the form of a scientific theory of the kind that we have in physics or chemistry. I feel sympathetic to that. So I also think that is one of Wittgenstein's important contributions as a critic of this idea of a scientific theory of society and politics. Then later there was David Bloor, a Scotsman who wrote about Wittgenstein and a social theory of knowledge, seeing that our human understanding is in fact a social phenomenon and has to be understood and interpret it in these ways. And I think that's again right. And then my Berkeley colleague Hannah Pitkin wrote a book called Wittgenstein and Justice, in which he did already ask this question: what can Wittgenstein tell us about politics? And what she focused on was how he is so concerned with concepts, that we take our concepts for granted. We give them an essentialist interpretation. We think they're the essences we identify with. And what we see is that these concepts have a much more complex structure and a complex use. And there, Wittgenstein can help us essentially in thinking about such issues. Hannah Pitkin also, so she wrote this book about Wittgenstein. She also wrote a book on the concept of representation and saying, look, we have this very simple-minded idea of what is political representation, but we need to kind of dissect this concept. And this, I think, was done in a deeply Wittgensteinian spirit.
And you think Wittgenstein can help there specifically?
Well, certainly the idea of concepts as expressing family resemblances, that is an important one. So I do want to say that there is no such thing as politics, as the politics has no single essence.
No.
It's really a field of related activities and institutions and structures and people relating to each other in manifold ways. And therefore there is also no such thing as the common good, because how we understand the good in a particular situation will change because the nature of the political changes. That leads over, of course, to my next book.
Yes, and we're going to talk about your next book in the next installment, because this last chapter actually is almost like a preface to the next book.
It was almost written as that, actually.
Yeah.
I was working on both books at the same time.
But to remain within this last chapter of yours, you mentioned that between theory and practice, it can be like the relationship between astronomy and the cosmos. That maybe you can map something, but no matter what we do in astronomy, it was not going to change whatsoever the configuration of solar systems or galaxies or superclusters of galaxies. And that one of the problems in political theory is there any kind of theory that will have any efficacy as in terms of action within the political sphere? So there, the question would be that if Wittgenstein can help us clarify concepts and some confusion surrounding our concept of representation, for example, or what we mean by the good or the common good, and why the political is not just it doesn't have an essence, but it's a whole set of practices and forms of life and language games. And even if we gain the utmost clarity that we didn't have before, would that still have any direct intervention in the political itself, or would we still be like astronomers mapping out something that exists in its own right?
Well, if Wittgenstein has anything to tell us about politics, it would be at the methodological level, how to think about it. But let me get back to this idea of astronomy versus social science, right? So the stars move quite independently of what theories we have about them. But when we look at the social world, of course, it turns out that the ways we see this social world is itself part of the social world, strangely enough. And therefore, if our thinking gets changed or changes about the social world, that changes also the social reality itself. So that's I think, the idea lying behind the usefulness of such a Wittgensteinian analysis.
For sure. But here we can go back to the Wittgenstein's idea of a language game, which is his way of naming a context, a social, cultural context in which the use of words take on meaning. And frankly, we in academia belong to we speak a language that is part of a language game. It's one among a whole plurality of them. And unfortunately, often we just speak among ourselves because our words are not transitive. No matter how much we may clarify for ourselves, complexify the notion of the political and representation and so forth, only rarely does it get beyond the walls of academia. And therefore, I hear what you're saying, that the way we think about something as a group actually changes the society that we live in, but we might be will we be doing more than changing our own academic community and the way in which we use our language games here in academia, or because that's what we're always frustrated by, as thinkers, intellectuals, we feel on the margins, and that there's a certain fecklessness about our own clarifications of complex issues in the political sphere.
Well, let me go back to Heidegger, whom we have mentioned before. He once said, and I thought this was a wonderful sentence, he said, questioning is the piety of thinking. That is, if we really ask ourselves, what's the point of, or why is thinking important? That is philosophical thinking. Heidegger suggests that it consists in this asking of questions and in the realization that we don't necessarily have an answer, in remaining within the question as something questionable, right? And I think Wittgenstein has something similar to offer. He at some point said it should be possible to write a book of philosophy consisting of nothing but questions. Right? It has no answers at all. It only has these questions, and it leaves the questions there, and it leaves you to grapple with these questions. So I sometimes say to my students, what you should realize is that philosophy is not a systematic theorizing. What it has contributed to human knowledge is the question mark. Right?
Yes.
And it is true, of course, that in politics we ask questions all the time, but we are also always full of convictions which we can't really back up and which we fight for quite irrationally against all good questioning. And so
Right.
the philosophy providing us with this questioning spirit does something absolutely central, not only to politics, but to human life. I think that's what it does, right?
No, I hear you, Hans, and I'm a little conflicted because I understand the piety of thought being in questioning, and I understand that I would never myself read a book of philosophy that's only questions. And in fact, when I read sometimes philosophers who start multiplying question after question after question, I lose my patience. I actually like it when I believe philosophy is under an obligation to posit and to affirm and to take a stance, because otherwise you are like Hegel's skeptic, as he says in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, that the skeptic, or we could say the questioner, if we conceive of the vocation of philosophy only as a questioning, then it has to have something to question. Therefore, it's parasitical of that which it's questioning. And it, as Hegel says, skepticism is the result of maybe some dogmatic assertions. And I'm not sure that we can do without not a dogmatic philosophy, but something that Wittgenstein associated with what he called faith as opposed to wisdom, something that has a fervent commitment, or what your colleague at Berkeley, Bert Dreyfus, when he was speaking about the internet and invoking Kierkegaard's notion of an infinite passion. If we do not have an infinite passion or an unconditional commitment to something, a principle or a faith or a belief or some, call it even a dogma, then our questioning will just be nothing but an endless kind of bad infinity in the Hegelian sense. That's what I worry about if we reduce philosophy only to the act of questioning. You see, I don't know if that.
Well, maybe I'm less skeptical about skepticism than you or my colleague Bert Dreyfus are. I think we have, as human beings, we have such a tendency to believe things, to be dogmatic about things, to be completely convinced that philosophy, the skeptical questioning as an antidote, is an important contribution that philosophy makes to human life. I would also say it is the Socratic contribution to human life. In my Cambridge Companion, in the introductory essay, I end up comparing Wittgenstein to Socrates, and I'm saying that's how you should read him. I know that I know nothing, but I'm questioning myself and others. And of course, in this process, hopefully truth will emerge, but that truth will be subjected to new questioning, and we don't kind of want to and should not want to shut this off too early. Right?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I think it needs to go on
Yeah.
in a very vigorous and healthy manner. But at the same time, if Plato had not posited certain truths that are in need of question, for example, equating beauty with truth and truth with goodness, or saying positing some kind of ideal beauty of world of forms and so forth, then our questioning will dry up very quickly if it feeds only on its own questioning. So I think philosophy needs both that spirit of skepticism as well as the spirit of taking the risk of committing of embracing some kind of faith in the secular sense of a faith, existential commitment.
Yeah.
You know?
So to get back to Wittgenstein, I would say that there are many controversies around the question how to read him. And he's read in many different ways. But one line, of course, is to read him as a skeptic, essentially. Yeah. That's what his big contribution to philosophy is. He tears down rather than establishes anything. And even the thesis that meaning is use is not a theory. It's a kind of a destruction of the attempt to say what meaning really is, because uses come in so many different ways. There's really no way in which we can spell that out in advance. But there are others who find that he is, after all, advancing some positive view, and they want to kind of extract. Certainly this seems evident in the Tractatus, but even in the investigations one can set out and try to extract a theoretical substructure. And so there are writings of Wittgenstein which try to reconstruct and systematize the view of language, meaning, life, the mind that he advances, right? So the texts are very elusive at times, as you know, right? He puts things before us, and often he leaves it to us to kind of make up our mind how we are supposed to respond at this point. And so they open themselves up to more than one reading, and we need to kind of course, battle this out, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with you there. And that one statement of his, which I quoted, that philosophy needs to return to the center around which our needs revolve, that opens up the question of what are our needs, and our needs are. And now we're going back to the first question with which we opened our show, namely, how do things stand in the historicist reading of Wittgenstein? Our needs, as you point out, historically evolve, they change, and we always have to be able to identify what is the need of the moment of our world at present, and that philosophy has to respond to that. And now, as I agree with you, we're in our greatest need is something that falls loosely under this word, the political, which in the next installment that we're going to do on your book, The Political and the Search for the Common Good, that we're going to ask what exactly does the political mean, what is a common good. And we're going to do it in a spirit of questioning, but without forgetting the fact that there are real needs here that are beyond just language games in the kind of demotic sense of games, no? That we're doing more than just playing around.
So I certainly think that Wittgenstein never really becomes a historically oriented thinker in the way in which Heidegger, for instance, did, or Nietzsche, and many others. But he thought about this question of history, certainly. So he starts off, as I suggested at the beginning, in a strictly anti-historical stance, and then he modifies this and opens himself up to... but he doesn't become a historicist. I'm a historicist. I think, yes, our needs and problems, the fundamental problems, change over time. I think his work relies much more on the idea that there are certain stable, set, permanent questions about the mind-body problem, let's say, which always come back and which we then need to always to think about. So there I go beyond him, definitely, right, and open myself up to a more varying and open-ended view of what philosophy is or should be.
That's what makes your book on Wittgenstein so special, which I highly recommend to all our listeners. It's just called Wittgenstein by Hans Sluga. So I want to remind our listeners we've been speaking with Professor Hans Sluga from the University of Berkeley, and that this is the first of two shows. It's going to be followed up with a discussion of his more recent book published in 2014 called Politics or the Search for the Common Good.
And the Search for the
And the Search for the common good.
It's not my title. The publisher wanted it.
Oh, is that right? Cambridge University
Yes.
Press wanted that title.
Yes.
Well, it works. It works.
Actually is a good title.
It's a
Yes,
good
I
title,
agree.
and it
Yeah.
attracts a lot of attention, and it's been getting a lot of attention. So we're definitely looking forward to having you on very, very shortly, Hans, for a follow-up discussion on that. I want to remind our listeners that this is Robert Pogue Harrison for Entitled Opinions, and that we're going to be with you next week. Thanks again for coming on, Hans.
Thank you, Robert.
Searching for the truth I find. I am